There we go. Dr. Farrell, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's a hat day for me,
It's
too.
a hat day for both of us.
Yes. My hat's a little more metro than yours. I don't know
Yeah,
if
I
you
like that. I like that
can
hat.
tell it's purple, you know.
Yeah, I like that hat.
I do, too. Yeah, it fits well. I found it at one of those, I don't know what you call it. It's kind of like an upscale hipster flea market thing where they have vendors, that sell new things. One is a haberdasher.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah, I liked it. I got it. It's the only short-brimmed fedora that I have.
Well, you're in good company with President Truman.
Oh,
He
well.
was a haberdasher.
He was a haberdasher.
Yep.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was. He was.
So even a haberdasher can be president.
That's right.
Well, that makes me wistful. But so, Dr. Farrell, the theme of today's show is looking back and filling in gaps.
All right.
And so I would like to revisit some of the things that we have either touched upon or strangely not touched upon, and some of the gaps that may have existed in those things. And I think about a year ago, we did a similar show, and I've meticulously made sure that I didn't repeat the things that I asked about then. I don't know if you remember, I asked you to fill in some things about the JFK assassination and Unabomber and some other things like that. Well, I don't think we actually did Unabomber. That would be interesting.
I think we talked about him briefly once, but I don't think we've ever done a show.
Yeah, we haven't. I got to wear my hoodie for that show too. That's the perfect time. We could both wear our hoodies.
Yep.
All right. Oh, you just admitted you have hoodies.
Yes,
so
I do.
For those who weren't listening closely,
I have a couple of hoodies with the Giza Death Star logo boldly emblazoned on the front that was given to me by one of our members, Jay Trout. Gave me these really nice hoodies that I wear around here in the winter. You know me, I like to keep my house like a meat locker, so I wear hoodies in the house during the winter.
Well, I won't wear my Comeback Barack hoodie because I know it'll get under your skin. But I have, I took my political dolls to a different office. I have been thinking about bringing those back so they pop up and talk to us once in a while during the show. Because Bill and Hillary have opinions, and I think getting them on.
Yes, we know they do.
They have thoughts they would like to share. I don't have a Chelsea doll, but I'm tempted to get one. So I just admitted I played with dolls. All right, so only the notable historical dolls.
Only the notable, yes, okay.
Yes, I don't. It's not like you. I don't have an Adam Weishaupt doll hidden behind a curtain.
I do not have an Adam Weishaupt. I don't have any kind of doll. Thank you very much.
That he admits to. Well, so the Albert Pike doll.
The Albert Pike.
Riding, charging with a sword, bareback. He's our pale-faced protector, That's what they called him, the pale-faced protector. Well, so I'll just lead off with Albert Pike since it comes up. So this is just a warm-up to get us warmed up. Now, you have talked about Pike before. But I want to hit the stuff that when I do a search on our website and I literally type in things like Albert Pike, those I get plenty of hits on, but there are ones today that I get 0. And I'm like, so Dr. Farrell's never mentioned this once in the entirety of Giza. And I think it deserves to be brought up in the show. So starting with Albert Pike, I'm going to mention something that you haven't actually addressed much. You did talk about it a little bit, and that's specifically the Paladins and the new and reformed Palladian Rite, headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina, Rome, Italy, and Berlin in Germany, which is interesting to have it be Charleston plus those other places. Now, Pike read 16 languages, which would be high levels of literacy and education are not unusual in the officers' corps in the Confederacy. But 16 languages is a high level of literacy in any corps. So that's notable. And of course, you tie that in previous writings with the fact that Pike is often best known not so much as a Confederate hero, but as an occult figure. And so you sort of link that exploratory. I mean, he must have been serious about researching something. Let's put it that way. So, and of course, you've talked before about the potential that radio technology existed long before it was publicly known to exist, and that Pike or the people that handled Pike and others in sort of the Masonic world stole that technology from Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
And which is kind of a cool steampunk or steampuke, if you don't like that kind of stuff, but steampunk kind of environment. And so I have a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
So one is, you would think that it's really hard to keep a secret like that, that if people are wandering around with technology in a briefcase that can transmit around the world, first, it would have to be incredibly powerful, because radio signals don't generally go that far unless they're shortwave or a specific type of radio signal.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a very large power source, a very large antenna, or access to some alternative physics. And then on top of that, so the first question has to do with, isn't it likely that if that technology existed, that it would have gotten out, that it would have become more widely known and used by people other than the Freemasons? The second question has to do with some of the descriptions around that radio technology, which you've quoted, that have to do with a kind of amulet, and that have to do with speaking in a way that sounds occult, but that being sort of a miasma of occult language around a technology. And so my question is, couldn't some of the ancient texts that express ancient religious texts that express various degrees of religious ecstasy and religious experience actually be technological descriptions that are sort of using that same sort of miasma to deflect from understanding of the technology that was possessed?
Oh, what a whopper of a question. Yeah, I don't know where to begin here. Let's take the ancient stuff first and then kind of work back to Pike. I do think, and I covered a bit of this in Babylon's Banksters, I do think that there are indications that there was some sort of, let's call it a simplified radio telegraphy technology that existed in ancient times. And for people that haven't read Babylon's Banksters, or for those that have, I spent a very small amount of time in that book going over the analysis of the German physicist Constantine Meyl, M-E-Y-L, that did an analysis of ancient temples, including the Pantheon in Rome, and concluded that they were set up as simple radio resonance cavities for simplified telegraphy. And the reason he got into this was he was reading statements in people like Juvenal, Cicero, Virgil, the standard Roman Silver Age classic authors that were talking about strange things. Some general out in the boonies wanted to get permission or get some decision from the emperor, so he sent to Rome. That's the expression that's used. He sent to Rome, and then heard from the emperor the next day. Well, how the heck does that happen? And most people say that it was kind of a semaphore fire signal system that they had set up, which they did. But if you've got generals in the field, they're moving around all the time. They're not going to be able to construct semaphore signaling stations as they're moving their armies around. So he came up with this idea that these temples were built as very simple radio telegraphy cavities, resonant cavities, that were using extremely low frequency. And this is an extraordinarily important point, because extremely low frequency is an earth penetrating form of radio. And we're going to get back to that in a minute, because that's a very important point. But then he coupled that to the idea that, you had soothsayers that were examining animal entrails and getting messages in these temples. And he speculated that the reason why they're doing that is that an organic membrane would be a sensitive enough membrane to get simple telegraphic, signals, dots and dashes and things like that. So he's thinking along very simple lines, but he's nevertheless thinking of a primitive radio technology. So let's leap forward to Albert Pike. And this, you're going back to a paper that when we first started this website, I put up a little paper, and I even did a blog. This was way back, I think almost 10, maybe even 11 years ago, about the possibility that Masonry had some sort of technology. And this was mentioned in a book that's called Occult Theocracy. It's kind of a rare book, but the lady that compiled this was largely her speculation. She referenced certain Masonic texts to a device that in Masonic literature was called the frog. And when she describes this, it's as if she's describing a very primitive telephone type apparatus, but it's actually used for radio signals, and they're depressing the tongue on the frog to send signals wirelessly. So I do think that there's a bit of evidence that they may have had within these lodges some access to that type of technology. The reason why is if we leap forward from Albert Pike's time, you mentioned Tesla, and it's very interesting that, and most people don't know this about Tesla. Tesla, if you look at his patents, Daniel, from let's say I'm going to say the early 1890s, and even maybe some of the very late ones in the 1880s. If you look at his patents and then kind of piece them together over time, what Tesla's doing is he's laying out each little bit of a wireless broadcast technology. And the interesting part of this is that when Marconi came along and supposedly, invented radio and sent the first transatlantic signal, Tesla took him to court and won and produced all of these patents that, he had basically laid out this whole technology before Marconi even made his broadcast, and claimed that it was his technology that Marconi had utilized, and he actually won that suit. So the real history of radio, if you stop and think about Marconi making his first radio broadcast, I think it was 1921, something like that, where they sent a transatlantic telegraphic signal by shortwave. Tesla is actually saying, no, I had this way back at the end of the 19th century. So that technology existed. If you look at it that way, that technology existed long before radio actually officially supposedly got its start, by about a good 20 to 30 years. So there's that factor. Now, there's one important factor here that I think is very, very crucial. And you mentioned, well, how did they keep this from getting out? My suspicion has always been, Daniel, that if there was such a technology, if Pike knew about it, for example, if there was such a technology, it certainly would have been classified by the Confederacy, and certainly after the war between the states, it certainly would have been classified by the U.S. government as well. And we do have an indicator that there may be something like this at work, because there's a little known, it's so little known, Daniel, that you really, really have to go online and dig for this. And it takes quite a lot of digging to pull this out. But during World War I, the British and the French suspected that the American Expeditionary Force under General Pershing had some means of secret communication with President Wilson back in Washington, and they could not figure out what it was. And lo and behold, and this was declassified many years after the end of World War I think in the 70s, there was indeed an extremely low frequency transmitter that had been built in this country with an antenna, one of those big antennas that they build into the ground. And they were using the earth as a broadcast medium for extremely low frequency radio waves. And Pershing had his equipment in France to, receive and transmit back. And this was how this was done. It was all very highly classified, very top secret. And there are some people that maintain that this was also used by Wilson when he went over to Versailles. In other words, he was getting intelligence and feedback and so on from the people already over in France before he even went over there. So that technology did exist, and I strongly suspect that the reason why we haven't heard of it, if these secret societies developed it or if they had access to it, that one reason that it wasn't out into the public earlier than it was because of the fact that somehow at some point after the American Civil War, the American government got a hold of it and it became a very, very highly classified matter. It's in conjunction, I suspect, Daniel, and I'm speculating here because I haven't talked to my friend Walter Bosley about this, but Walter's done a lot of research about the 19th century airship mystery. And again, you had the same sort of pattern in evidence in the airship mystery of an alleged group of private investors, both in this country and Europe, developing this airship technology. I strongly suspect that there is a relationship between that and the fact that you had some sort of primitive radio technology clearly in existence, if you follow Tesla's patents, clearly in existence before the public emergence of radio technology.
And now, what about this issue of ancient texts using similar language of ecstasy to cover for technological advancements?
I think that's highly possible, particularly in certain instances where you do have particularly in the Roman writers, where you have these descriptions of priests getting an ecstatic message and delivering their oracles. I think that there is a clear possibility, and again, the new book that I just wrote goes into this, that one way of broadcast is direct radio broadcast to the brain. They have it now to the point where they can directly broadcast voices into the brain. So I don't have any difficulty. If they figured out radio way back when in some simplified form, maybe they figured out a way to modulate enough information into the carrier wave so that these priests are thinking that they're hearing voices and so on and so forth, or pretending. That's the other part of this, pretending to hear voices and going into ecstasies, and really they're just getting intelligence from somewhere else. So I think that would be entirely possible if you admit the premise of Dr. Mile that these temples were composed as radio resonant cavities. And I think it's fairly clear that they probably are of some sort, because he puts a diagram of a Vestal temple in Rome, one of the Vestal temples to the Vestal Virgins in Rome. He puts the floor plan of this temple, and then in his book, and then next to it he puts the diagram of a modern magnetotron, which is a device that you need for radar and radios and so on, and they're almost identical. So in his thinking, it's clearly they had some knowledge of electromagnetism that we don't credit them for.
And even without, we know they're ancient batteries, but even without that level of technology, I mean, it's dramatized, not that it's fact-based necessarily, but it's dramatized in the TV series Rome. They go to one of the temples, and just like in some museums now and some very old buildings, there are places you can stand and hear everything that happens
exactly
in a place that you can't normally hear it. They had dramatized in Rome, in the TV show Rome, it's like a bird that you would talk into, and apparently it was a trick. It was a well-known trick to some of the elite, that it had the ability to transfer that sound to a hidden room and so on, without electronics. It was just using acoustics.
Well, you had similar, you had similar things even in Byzantium.
Right.
You had similar tricks that they would use to impress foreign ambassadors with, with the divine technological prowess of the Byzantine Empire. The throne would levitate and things like this, and the mechanical lions would roar and move,
Very
and
elaborate
all of
cuckoo
very, yeah,
clocks.
very, very elaborate stuff. And we don't give these people enough credit. So I don't have any. I've been working in this field for so long, and looking at these ancient texts, and then trying to compare them to modern physics. In fact, I just finished a blog before we started. Somebody had sent me an article about a recent scientific paper that is theorizing basically that sound waves, phonons and sound waves have negative mass, that they actually are a kind of an anti-gravity thing. And I was gobsmacked, because you have all of those ancient legends from Egypt to Tibet to Mesoamerica that the priests are levitating and moving these great big stones for their temples using sound and singing and instruments and so on. So, nothing surprises me anymore. And we may be playing catch up here with public versus secret history.
Oh, when I go to a business conference and I hear somebody who's standing up front is either over amplified or can barely be heard, so the choice is to be drowned out by their voice or to not hear them. I'm reminded that ancient Greek theaters were perfect acoustic structures where you could hear someone in the center of the structure from 60 meters away.
Yep.
Perfectly well, because of the acoustic steps and the design as an acoustic conductor. Well,
yep.
I want to just ask you a couple more questions about pike, and then we can move on to one of those things that when I type it into the Giza search box, it comes up with nothing. A couple of thoughts. So with Albert Pike, he is rumored to have, not rumored, well known to have used excessive and extreme brutality in his raids, and to so much to the point that the allies of the Confederates, the unofficial allies, the British, rebuked the Pike's group over the matter. And I can't help but wonder why he wouldn't receive a similar rebuke from those involved in the Masonic rites of which he was a part, unless in fact they approved of such brutality. And that would lead one to question whether or not those acts of brutality were a vehicle or a field for him to conduct essentially ritual harm of other people. And I mean, it goes well beyond just eliminating, enemy combatants. So to what degree does potentially Pike and the Paladins, to what degree do they represent a form of human sacrifice or ritual destruction? And second, and what does Masonry have to say about that? And secondly, I can't help but when I think of this ability that Pike and his people are rumored to have, to be able to get information from one part of the world to another very quickly before any known mode of transportation could convey that information. What pops into my head is Oswald. What pops into my head is the fact that Oswald, there were reports of Oswald as the killer being reported before those events could possibly have been transmitted by anyone, really, from Dallas. And so my question is an odd one, but is there a possibility that there is a temporal component to Tesla's inventions around communication, and what they actually have is a form of temporal communication and not just long distance communication, such that you could communicate a fact to somebody going back in time?
Oh my word!
I told you you'd enjoy this show.
Doff my hat, Daniel. Gee whiz! Wow. All right. The ritual abuse I read years ago, and I don't even remember where I read it. Details of Pike's life and his let's just call it what it is. His debauchery, his lasciviousness, licentiousness, his sexual predations. there's really no other way to put this man. And as far as the brutality, I mean, he rivals Nathan Bedford Forrest, the other notorious Confederate raider, in terms of the brutality of some of the things that Pike did. To my knowledge, Daniel, there is no Masonic response to this that I'm aware of. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any. I'm not a Scottish Rite Mason, so I don't know. But to me, the key here, that there is some connection of a pattern within some circles of Masonry to this type of behavior, goes back to Adam Weishaupt and the Bavarian Illuminati, because when you read his plans, not only to infiltrate the Grand Orient and other non-blue lodges of Masonry in Europe, one of the things that he is clearly involved in is sexual license. He's one of the first people that you encounter in Masonic circles with a clear interest in abortion, in its practice, and so on and so forth. This is clear from his own writings, that he's involved in something that is not terribly good. And the problem here is that this pattern seems to go wherever you find some of these higher order Masonic orders, not only in Europe, because you find this pattern again with the P2 Lodge in Italy, people involved in sexual ritual and so on and so forth. The interesting thing to me here is that Pike, of course, eventually settles in Charleston, South Carolina. This is where he headquarters the Scottish Rite. And you have in Father Malachi Martin's last book, his novel Windswept House, you have one of these child sacrifice sex rituals being performed at the same time in Charleston as it is in Rome. And this is being done in the book, in the novel, prior to the commencement of the Second Vatican Council, in order to ensure their success and so on. I have no problem, really, with seeing some patterns here within certain circles of Masonry, because, again, you have them involved at a very deep level in the Revolution and terror in France during the Revolution. You certainly encounter the pattern in other lodges in Europe as well. So I don't have any problem with that. And I do think, although there has never been any documented proof, but the fact that the pattern shows up again in Albert Pike, who has his connections very obviously to some of the European Masons. Just think of Giuseppe Mazzini and people like this that Pike is in correspondence with. So I have no doubt that at some point some of this crosses the Atlantic, and that there's some sort of connection, that they're doing all of this. And I think one of the reasons they're doing this type of activity is just simply to, for blackmail purposes. They get people involved in this activity, and then, they've got them. So I don't have any difficulty with that. The other question here, is there a possibility that some of this technology would be capable of a temporal displacement? And I got to tell you, Daniel, that's such a whopper. In the new book, one of the things that I did not get into in the new book in a major way, although I was tempted to put it in there, was the fact that one of the most frequently encountered problems that any scientists investigating so-called psychic research have discovered is the apparent ability of people. And there's a very famous case, I forget what the scientist's name was, from Sweden, that was doing this type of experiment. The Russians ran into it as well. And there's no doubt in my mind that at some point during the Stanford Research Institute experiments with remote viewing that they probably ran into this as well, that there does appear to be some sort of channel where information flows backward in time, and that this phenomenon does not appear simply to be electromagnetic in nature. There's another mechanism or medium in play, and that was dramatically exhibited, in my opinion, at the random number generators in the hours and, in fact, a couple of days before 9/11, when those random number generators began to lose randomness and started to cohere. And you saw this rise in the coherence of these number generators in beginning a couple days before 9/11, and then it really peaked a couple of hours before 9/11 events actually started to unfold. So there appears to me to be some vehicle of transfer of information back in time. Now, as I said, most of the experiments in psi, in paranormal research that scientists have done, have run across this, and it's baffled them, because when they've conducted these types of telepathy or ESP experiments, one of the things that they have done early on, Daniel, is they started to isolate their people that they were testing in Faraday cages for the express purpose of making sure that this is not an electromagnetic transfer of information. And in most of these cases, there is some sort of coherent transfer of information. And in one case, a Swedish psychiatrist that was doing these tests was getting his subjects that were responding to a random, he had a bunch of those ESP cards that he was, shuffled the deck and he would show them the card. And this person was supposed to transmit what he saw to the person in the Faraday cage. Well, in so many cases, he discovered the person in the Faraday cage was guessing what was next even before he turned the card over. And he theorized that there had to be some temporal transmission of information back in time or some future anticipation. Either way, you've got a temporal displacement. So, yeah, I think it's possible. The real problem is, I think your question is suggesting whether or not that could be modulated onto an electromagnetic broadcast technology. I'm almost 90% certain that it could, in some fashion. And I'm not going to give away the secret for people that haven't read the book, but I think that it's highly likely that would be possible. That's a whopper of a question.
And well, it occurred to me that this, if such a capability existed, it could be inherent to the technology, or it could be something paired with the technology. But I wondered if an application of it could have been utilized in the Kennedy assassination.
Well, in the Kennedy assassination, I think what you're referring to is that Lieutenant Colonel Fletcher Prouty had been sent by General Lansdale to Antarctica. He was on his return flight through Christchurch, New Zealand. And it was there he bought a paper, the local Christchurch newspaper, that already fingered Oswald as the assassin before he had even been booked for anything in Dallas. And Prouty's conclusion was very different. It wasn't a case of a reverse temporal displacement of information. What it was the CIA had, already selected him as the patsy and simply supplied all of the biographical information and details about Oswald to the Associated Press, and Christchurch newspaper picked it up and ran it in New Zealand before, the story, they got their story straight and their ducks lined up in Dallas, which was a major oops. So in that case, I'm doubting it. However, like I say, I think there's something about the 9/11 random number generator, the sudden coherence there that occurred, that may again indicate that there's a possibility of technological modulation of that information in a broadcast medium. So that I think is possible. The Kennedy case, I'm kind of skeptical about.
So my next question has to do with an organization that does not come up when I search Giza. And I'll probably say it wrong, but it looks like the Haute Venti Romaine.
The Haute Venti. Okay, yes. All right. I know what you're talking about.
So an organization from 1814 to 1848
Yes.
that is supposed to have directed all secret society activity. So my question to you is twofold. Number one, it's why has it never been mentioned on Giza? And number two, what can you tell us about it?
Well, number one, I don't talk publicly about a lot of the secret society stuff that that I know, and I've got a fairly large library about all of that stuff. I don't talk about it publicly because the stuff I do talk about is already far out there enough. I don't need to add secret societies to it. The Haute Vente Romaine was a French higher. If I recall correctly, it's been many years since I even thought about that group, was a French higher Masonic order, like so many of these orders that claim to have, the true secrets and so on and so forth. But what's very interesting to it, as if I recall correctly, and my memory is very sketchy here, was that it was one of these societies that arose in Europe after the fall of Napoleon. And I think that's highly significant because I think Napoleon was definitely kind of a figurehead that was used by the French and other Masonic lodges to carry the revolution from France all across Europe and so on and so forth, which of course he was quite successful in doing. After his fall, you see the rise not only in France, but you see the rise in Italy. You see the rise in what would become Germany, Austria, Greece, and so on. All the Balkan states that were at that time under the Turkish yoke. You see the rise of these Masonic groups that are basically kind of nationalist revolutionary fronts that will coordinate the 1848 revolution. They are certainly involved in coordinating the Paris Commune, and in my opinion, they're definitely active in the coordination of the nationalist movements that will eventually take the Ottoman Empire out of the Balkan Peninsula and restore those countries to their own national independence. Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, all of those countries right up until the very end of the 19th century were under the Ottoman Empire. So the Haute Vente Romaine, I think, was one of these lodges that was kind of, if I can put it this way, kind of a coordinating body for a lot of this international activity, because you had a lot of these other national organizations kind of tied to it. The Carabinieri in Italy and so on and so forth definitely were tied to this thing. And again, Daniel, I'm going on decades of memory lapse here for not having kept up with that aspect of my studies. So I may be talking off the end of the twig here, but that's what I recall about that organization.
Well, the twig is just a normal day. I'm not worried about that. So
one in his column there.
Another organization that comes up with a zilch when I search is the Carbonari.
Yes.
So Carbonari from 1800 to 1831,
Yes.
not considered to be as far-reaching as the Haute Vente Romaine, I think you said, but responsible in large part for contributing to attempts at Italian unification.
Yes.
And resistance to French occupation.
Yes.
in the time after Napoleon,
Right.
and also called the Carbonari of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies.
Yep.
I don't know why there are two Sicilies, but okay. So a couple of things about this. I want to know what you can tell us about the Carbonari, and it's sort of the same question. Why is it not mentioned on Giza? It seems like this would tie in a lot with the esoterica you're mentioning. But the other has to do with the rise of the mafia, which happens shortly thereafter.
Yes.
And I saw an episode of The Sopranos, and in the episode of The Sopranos, you know, it's fictionalized, so I'm not taking it as fact. But they decide to make one of the guys a made man, and so they invite him over to Tony's house, the boss's house, and they have all their friends and other made guys there. And they take a card, like a playing card, that has a picture of St. Peter on it, and they burn the card. And they say, as this card of St. Peter burns, so may your soul burn in hell if you ever betray your friends. And so that's the first observation. The second is that the word mafia is rumored to be an acronym, MAFIA, that stands in Italian for essentially death to the French, Italy cries. Morta alla Francia, Italia anela, or something like that. And I heard that refuted in a forum where somebody says that's ridiculous because acronyms didn't exist that far back. They're fairly recent, which I have to say that's ridiculous. Because not only were acronyms used in Rome prior to the Christians, but they were used by the Christians in Rome precisely to conceal information, but also in Christian iconography, the nomina sacra, the names of God, or the very often then the names of the saints, they would show the first and the last letters. So when you look at a Russian icon now, you'll see the first and the last letter, or a Greek icon, and it tells you, if you understand something about who you're looking at, it tells you who that saint is. And of course, we get, Anno Domini, and all kinds of acronyms coming from Rome. So not only deeply rooted in ancient Rome, but therefore in Italy, and therefore perfect for something like the mafia. And whether or not that acronym holds or not, my question, after seeing what looks for all the world like an occult ritual presented as a mafia ritual, my question is whether or not the Carbonari had something to do with the founding of the mafia, and whether in fact the mafia is in many ways an extension of the revolutions of the 1840s, the rise of secret societies, and is itself a secret society, regardless of what it evolved into, is itself at root a secret society rooted in the occult.
Oh yeah, I absolutely think so. Let me take this as far as I can remember seriatim. The Carbonari I have not mentioned on Giza, and again for the same reason. It's largely just because to get into public discussions of the role of secret societies in the movements of history, particularly in the 19th century in Europe, and their connection to all of these nationalist movements that are going on, would involve me in I think some impolitic discussion. But I'm not hesitant to talk about it. For that matter, I mentioned the Alta Vendita Lodge in Italy, which is an offspring. It was one of these Carbonari lodges that was very prominent in Italy and survived longer than the actual Carbonari did. The Alta Vendita Lodge I talked about in the appendix to Financial Vipers of Venice, the statements of Piccolo Tigre about infiltrating the Roman Catholic Church until they got a pope that essentially was a Masonic pope, which I tie to Pius IX and to the whole proclamation of papal infallibility, because there are researches that were done by traditionalist Roman Catholics at the time that were fingering Pius IX as having been inducted into a lodge in Philadelphia. And this was actually put out by the then Cardinal Archbishop of Santiago de Chile. And the interesting thing is he concludes that, well, he's checked the records of the Masonic lodges in Philadelphia in the United States. And as I point out in the book, that if you are following Masonic practice in Europe at the time, what you did was you created code names for cities in Europe that were encoded. So, just because there's a record that Pius IX was inducted in Philadelphia doesn't necessarily mean that he traveled to the United States and was inducted there. It simply means that he probably was inducted in a European or perhaps a South American city when he was there that was codenamed Philadelphia. It doesn't necessarily mean anything other than that. But again, the Alta Vendita Lodge, if you look at it, and the Carbonari in general, if you look at it, what emerges is a very interesting picture. You have Giuseppe Mazzini, one of the early well-known Italian revolutionaries, Giuseppe Garibaldi, who of course eventually creates modern Italy, unifies Italy at approximately the same time that German unification takes place under Bismarck. And Garibaldi, in turn, and this is what's very interesting to me, is related and definitely an agent for the House of Savoy, the Kingdom of Sardinia, Sicily, and Naples, and so on, that eventually becomes the Italian monarchy after Italian unification. So behind the other part of this story, and this is another reason I don't mention it very much in the public page, is that you do have this very curious blend, not only of these nationalist movements and lodges that are driving this revolution, but behind the scenes, you have the participation of a lot of the royal houses in them. Just think of Frederick the Great in Prussia and his membership in the Three Globes Lodge there in Berlin. And he's got Voltaire there at the same time, and Baron von Swieten, and all these guys are not only representatives of those traditional interests in Europe, but they're also all members of lodges. So I find that fact very curious, and I really don't know what to make of it other than, again, the pattern is set for their involvement in those types of activities, once again, by the Bavarian Illuminati. When you look up the records of that group of people and find out who was involved as members of that organization, you find princes, you find dukes, you find well-known professors at that time in various universities, and they're all members of this this organization that is avowedly out, to create a political revolution in Europe and ostensibly, and I underline that word, ostensibly overthrow their power. This is exactly the pattern that we see in the Carbonari in Italy. You've got revolutionary activity, you've got the unification of Italy, but yet behind that, you have the House of Savoy, and King Victor Emmanuel III. So something's going on here. I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. The mafia, I think, Daniel, definitely is tied to the Carbonari activity. And it is also tied to Sicily and that whole affair that happened in the Middle Ages, in my opinion, with the Sicilian Vespers, Emperor Frederick II, and so on, who made Sicily his headquarters and was again in defiance of ecclesiastical authority in Rome. And again, it's the Emperor Frederick that we must remember that goes on to create his own kind of secret society in the Teutonic Knights. So we again have this pattern of royal or imperial involvement in these secret societies that is so much a pattern that we see in the 19th century. The Cosa Nostra, it's our cause, the kissing of rings, and so on and so forth. I've often wondered privately if the rings of mafia dons are in fact Masonic rings, and that this is why, you know, they don't wear them publicly. They bring them out in their meetings with each other and smoke their cigars and plot world domination together. I've suspected that. There's no proof of that other than, again, that strange collapse when the Italian government shut down the Loghe Propaganda Due under Licio Gelli back in the 1980s, when you found all of these Italian politicians, industrialists, bankers, and so on and so forth that were all involved in this lodge. So, and quite a few mafia figures as well. Michele Sindona, you know, the mafia banker, was a member of this outfit. So I don't doubt that there's some connection. It may be one of just overlap. It may be a much more deep connection, as I suspect it is. But again, I'm not aware of any evidence that would substantiate the latter.
So I'm going to ask you about one more organization. And I got it sort of broken up into various organizations, various scandals, various marginalia. So the marginalia isn't marginalia, but I don't have another term for odd things. So miscellany. But also, when I searched Giza for the Priory of Zion, I got nothing.
Oh boy!
And so, of course, the Priory of Zion, if I Wikipedia it, it will tell me that it's a hoax, that it was created as a hoax, and yet I think there's some connection that you've explored with the Knights of Malta and so on, and I'm curious what you can tell us about the Priory of Zion, and I get why you haven't talked about it, but maybe you can comment now.
Well, the Priory of Zion was the secret society. Well, everybody's familiar with the movie Da Vinci's. Oh God, what was that guy's name? Dan Brown. The Priory of the movie that starred Tom Hanks as the professor.
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code.
Yeah, the Da Vinci Code. Thank you. Yeah, the Priory of Zion is allegedly the secret society behind the Da Vinci Code, and so on and so forth. And Dan Brown, as far as I'm concerned, there was a recent lawsuit in Great Britain that was settled in Brown's favor, but it was brought by some authors that wrote a book, 2 books actually, back in the late 1980s. One was called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and then the sequel to that was called The Messianic Legacy. And the books themselves purport to record a secret society by the name of the Priory of Zion that was led by a French nobleman by the name of Pierre Plantard. And he was supposedly the Grand Master of this thing, along with Jacques, what's his name? Jacques Cocteau, and that the Grand Masters of this organization went all the way back to the Templar period and an event where the Priory broke off from the Templars and they went their separate ways. So in other words, purportedly, this is a secret society going back to the Middle Ages. And the central mythology of this secret society, which again gets translated into the Dan Brown book, the Da Vinci Code, and thence into the movie, is that the early Merovingian dynasty in France were descendants of Christ and Mary Magdalene, and that the Merovingians were thus part of the group known as the Thespacini in Greece, which is a term that refers to the brothers of the Lord, the human relatives of Christ. And the books, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the Messianic Legacy, in turn tie that whole meme into the mystery at Rennes-le-Château in France, which is a legitimate mystery, I have to point out, where in the late 19th century, the local curé, the local priest at the little church in that village, supposedly was doing some renovations on the church and then made a discovery. He discovered that one of the pillars on the altar in the church was hollow, and supposedly this contained parchments, which the fellow's name was Baron Garçonnière. All right, Father Baron Garçonnière. And he then, and this is true, he took whatever he found up to Paris to the Church of Saint-Sulpice de Paris, which is an interesting church because, of course, that's the church that appears in the movie, The Da Vinci Code. That particular church in Paris at that time was well known to be kind of a hotbed, for want of a better expression, for kind of a traditional Roman Catholic occult sort of activity. I don't know how else to describe it. And it was at that time. Albert Renan was a biblical scholar there. You had all sorts of other things going on. The Compagnie de Sacre Sacrament was at the Church of Saint-Sulpice de Paris. So there was this coterie of kind of esoteric scholars that gathered in or around or were affiliated in Paris with that church. And incidentally, that church was, the church where one of my favorite organists and composers, Charles-Marie Widor, was the titular organist there. So you had Baron Garçonnière going off to Paris with whatever he found. He comes back from Paris, and this is what adds to the mystery of this Priory of Zion thing. He comes back from Paris and begins these expensive modifications to this little church in this little village. And the modifications themselves are, by anyone's lights, very bizarre. They're not the Stations of the Cross and things like this that you would associate with the traditional Roman Catholic Church are all kind of bizarre. The artwork is bizarre. And on top of this, he leads, up until his death, he leads the life of a French nobleman. He's living high on the hog, quite literally. And, he's obviously not able to do so on a village priest's stipend. And to this day, no one can figure out where the heck did he get all of his money. When he died, the priest who heard his confession, apparently for whatever reason, would not grant him absolution, and apparently just was so totally freaked out that he didn't want to have anything to do with his funeral. The funeral was not a traditional Roman Catholic funeral by any stretch of the imagination. They had Father Berengar propped up in a chair wearing these weird robes, and that essentially was his funeral. So something happened there. Allegedly, he was visited by one of the Habsburgs at one point who made a trip to Rennes-le-Château. And some people speculate, even my late friend and colleague in this kind of alternative field, Jim Mars, speculated that the source of his money was maybe the House of Habsburg. Who knows? I don't know. The priory is more complex than just being a hoax. That's not to say I don't think it's a hoax. I do think it is a hoax, but it is a very complex one. And if you've read Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or The Messianic Legacy, you'll know just how complex it really is, because this fellow that deposited supposedly all of these documents from the Priory of Zion, Pierre Plantard, was himself a kind of a French neo-fascist Vichyite that was maintaining that he was the Dauphin, the heir of the French monarchy, and apparently, had the documents to prove it. So he deposits all of this stuff about the Priory of Zion, which, if it's a hoax, then he deposits this and these records in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which, again, you have to have some chops in order to get something that's a complete hoax deposited in the French National Archives. So So there's something more here going on than meets the eye. I don't know exactly what it is, other than, again, I think you have an attempt to drive into the public consciousness a version of Christian history that is certainly not Orthodox Roman Catholicism or Lutheranism or anything else. And that in turn is reliant upon the idea of the Desposini. Now, the reason I'm going on and on about all of this is, again, something very peculiar about Father Malachi Martin, because Father Martin wrote a book, I think in 1978, I think it was, called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Church. Now, in that book, he spent several pages actually talking about the Desposini, the fleshly relatives of Christ. And there is such a group of people. There are groups of Greeks to this day in Greece that claim to be Desposini. The intriguing thing about Father Martin is that he points out that the Desposini are not basing their claims on Christ having children with Mary Magdalene. They are basing their claims on being relatives of James, the brother, and so on and so forth. So it's a very different thing. But he also goes on to point out in that book that this topic was going to become a major topic. It would be driven into the public consciousness. And this is about 10 years, of course, before Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or Messianic Legacy come out. And Father Martin does this over and over again in his books. He's ahead of the curve by about 10 years for some reason. And again, I think it's because his connections inside the Vatican were so good. So he kind of predicted, which again throws this whole Priory of Zion story into yet another cocked hat. Whereas he getting the information, did he know even at that time that Pierre Plantard was going to be driving this thing into the public eye and depositing those documents in the Bibliothèque Nationale? I don't know. It's more than just a simple hoax, though. I'm convinced of that.
Well, that rounds out our organizational look back and filling in the gaps. So that was fun. A trip through Confederate steampunk, the Paladins, and the Priory of Zion, or steampuke if you prefer.
More like the latter.
So I want to ask you now, moving on from organizations to various scandals.
Okay.
So you've written extensively. No one can accuse you of not writing about the BCCI affair. And we'll include an interesting link. I once did some digging on the Federation of American Scientists website, and so I dug up a link that I found the other day that's still pertinent about that. But I did that many years ago, a couple of decades ago, really. But even though you talk a lot about the BCCI affair, you don't hardly ever mention Barings Bank, and there's nothing if I search BNL scandal. And so I wonder what has been left out, or what have you not said? Maybe it's because it's not important, or maybe because it's important and you're not telling us. But why so little mention on Giza of Barings Bank and the BNL scandal?
Oh boy, BNL. I'm assuming. Jeez,
told you.
I'm assuming you mean the Banco de Lavoro or whatever it is in Italy. All right, Barings. I can handle that one very easily. I do mention
Banca Nazionale de Lavoro.
Yeah, de Lavoro. That's right. Thank you. Barings. I do mention in the webinar, in the members area, on the Louisiana Purchase. All right. Because there's a huge, as I point out in the webinar, to kind of summarize it, if people haven't watched it, I would urge you to go do so. Because there's more than going on with the Louisiana Purchase than meets the eye, and most of it's unresolved as far as I'm concerned. Turn the clock back. You've got Napoleon Bonaparte and Thomas Jefferson making a deal to sell the Louisiana Territory, which Napoleon had Spain returned to France. That's another part of the story. And of course, we know the story in the textbooks. Jefferson buys Louisiana from Napoleon Bonaparte, who needs the money to finance his wars. But what they're not telling you are all the strange little details surrounding this, namely that the underwriting for the bonds that were financing the purchase on the American end was underwritten by Barings Bank. And Barings, in turn, floated those bonds because, of course, they're at war with Napoleon. So Barings turns around and floats the bonds in Amsterdam, along with another big English bank at the time. And the bonds are floated in Europe. So you have the most bizarre picture. You have European opponents or nominal allies of Napoleon buying the bonds from Barings to float the purchase of Louisiana by Thomas Jefferson. Okay. And to put a little more of a cherry on this impacts Lewis and Clark, because there are people, and I'm one of them, that maintains that the death of Captain Lewis is extremely fishy, because supposedly he's on his way to Washington, D.C., taking documents for what will eventually become the published journals of the expedition to President Jefferson. And of course, he's murdered along the way. And poof, we are never told what happened to the manuscripts that he was ostensibly supposed to be carrying to Thomas Jefferson. Okay, the documents drop out of the story. But oddly enough, when the expedition notes are published, the person that publishes them is Nicholas Biddle, who is president of the Bank of the United States, who, of course, goes down into history after his prolonged fight with President Andrew Jackson. So, we have to wonder exactly why is Nicholas Biddle ending up editing these documents and publishing them. And I suspect, again, that his role as a banker has something strong to do with it, because, once again, who's one of the major shareholders of the Bank of the United States at the time? Why, it just happens to be Barings Bank. So Barings used to be called the sixth great power back in that day because of, it had its fingers, and, they were kind of the Rothschilds of the day. They had their fingers in every pie around the world. So there is something going on there, but I do talk about Barings. I just never have publicly, because, again, the involvement of that bank and especially the way it went down, this guy in Singapore supposedly making trades for the bank that turned out to be disastrous. I'm just not buying that story. If the bank was that exposed to one individual, I have suspicions that story is probably a cover for something else. What, I don't know. Now, the B&L scandal is a totally different ball of wax. Again, I haven't talked about it publicly, Daniel, because to get into that story, you're getting into the whole cesspool, really, of events surrounding the Banco Ambrosiano disaster, the death of Roberto Calvi, who was found hung under London Bridge with bricks stuck in his pockets. The B&L scandal branches out even into a connection with the American Department of Agriculture floating loans to Saddam Hussein to allow Hussein to buy chemical weapons and use them against Iran, and on this goes. And the B&L, the Banco Nacional de Lavoro, also had close ties, not just to Banco Ambrosiano, but also had close ties to Michela Sindona, the mafia banker that was eventually jailed in this country. And it had close ties to the Vatican Bank, to the then head of the Vatican Bank, and also personal head of Pope John Paul II's security, an American bishop by the name of Paul Marcinkus, who ended up actually being an archbishop before he retired. And in turn, because of the heavy presence of people like Roberto Calvi and Michela Sindona, these guys were also implicated in the P2G scandal in Italy, the Masonic lodge in Italy that the Italian government shut down. And when they shut it down, they found out that these ties ran right into the Vatican and right into the Vatican Bank. And the additional problem, the additional reason I haven't talked about it, is because at that time that all of this is happening, who's Pope? Well, it's not John Paul II, it's John Paul I, Albino Cardinal Luciani, Patriarch of guess where? Venice, okay, that had been elected Pope. And Luciani was an interesting character any way you slice him, because he was definitely an outsider. He was not a curial cardinal. He, of course, is coming from Venice, which is historically, as everybody knows, one of the major banking centers of Renaissance Italy. And the Venetian nobility are certainly still there. They're certainly still powerful in local politics there. Luciani's coming in, and he brings with him people into the Curia, like Archbishop Benelli and so on, and they're appalled at the corruption that they're seeing. And you know, most of the alternative histories of Pope John Paul I's very short pontificate indicate that he was prepared to really clean house, and one of the things high on his list was the Vatican Bank. And reportedly, as he's reading reports of the B&L scandal, Ambrosiano, Roberto Calvi, the P2G scandal, Michela Sindona, all of this stuff is coming into him. Archbishop Benelli supposedly also brought him a list of Masons who had infiltrated the Vatican. And this happened, apparently, I think this is in David Yallop's book about Pope John Paul I. Supposedly this was a day or two before the Pope was found dead in his apartments in the Vatican by the nun that attended him. And this is a reason, really, Daniel, I haven't commented about B&L, because that's one of those threads, Daniel, that if you pull on it, it's going to lead you pretty much everywhere. It's going to lead you directly to the BCCI scandal. It will even lead you through some very circuitous routes to the collapse of the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia, which, you know, everybody is more or less agreed upon now was a CIA front. It will lead you to Bishop Marcinkus, the Vatican Bank, Licio Gelli, and no one to this day, Daniel, I don't think, because of the complex nature of the connections of B&L, and not only to other institutions, but to other events and curious, suspicious things. No one to this day has put together what I regard as a picture that's comprehensive enough that can account for what the heck was going on with all of this stuff back then. I do think very clearly that Roberto Calvi paid for it with his life, the head of the Banco Ambrosiano. I think that Michela Sindona was probably tossed to the wolves. I think Licio Gelli, who incidentally flees to Argentina, knew more than he ever told. I think a pope was probably murdered because of it. You know, if they're willing to murder popes, they're not going to think twice about hacks from South Dakota. So, you know, I don't talk about it in any great detail publicly, but certainly that bank had its fingers in a lot of pies. And like I say, even the Iran-Iraq war has a B&L connection.
The Italian term for the constellation of banking scandals they had It might be in Italian bancopoli, but it looks like bankopoly,
Yeah,
which I
yeah.
thought you'd find funny, kind
Yep.
of like monopoly.
Yep.
And,
Exactly.
well, I want to
Exactly.
ask you about a different type of scandal, which may seem like we're going off topic. Somebody brought this up before, but I want to address this issue. So, and I'll tie it back in to explain why we would. So, in addition to the banking scandals, roughly at a time that overlays the banking scandals, but also going back much farther, are something that could be called, as a constellation, the church property scandals. And
Yes.
these, and one might even say these are the Episcopal version of the mortgage crisis housing bubble fiasco of 2007. And right away, we have some ears that are saying, I'm not Christian, I don't need the religious material. And so I heard that argument the other day from a viewer. And I want to make the argument that sometimes when we talk about these things, they do apply to you, and they do affect you. And your particular religion or lack thereof isn't relevant to whether this is relevant to you. And so try to hear past, I would say, the religious trappings around the issue and the religious terminology, because part of my question to you, Dr. Farrell, will be precisely how this relates to us, ordinary people. So, I mean, we aren't necessarily what a lot of people would consider a mainstream religious people either. So, so back to church property scandals. These things escape notice, and very often one of the reasons I suspect they escape notice is that the word scandal is not tied to them in the press. Because it's religious, it is very often looked at as an internal dispute between people who aren't using rationality and facts, but are using beliefs, and therefore it's sort of written off and slides right by us without us realizing that something serious has happened. And that we are talking about organizations the size of international banks in which these events occur, and that there may be some connections between these organizations and the banks. So when we talk about church property scandals, we are talking about, for example, breakaway parishes, who now there's a dispute between the episcopate, the bishop's diocese, and the parish over who owns the property. We're also talking about depositions that, meaning deposing a bishop or a priest, that occur and then are followed immediately by a seizure of property. So one of my questions, I'm going to rattle off a series of initial questions. So one of my questions is, what relation do some of the recent church property scandals have, if any, to the mortgage crisis and housing bubble, which also saw incredible widespread property seizures in 2007 to 2009? Secondly, what, if anything, do these property scandals or property grabs, if one wants to look at it that way, have to do with some other ones that don't even register on the radar of mainstream Christians as being related because they're not mainstream Christians? So, for instance, Waco. One could argue that property is at stake. Ruby Ridge. One could argue that this is about property boundaries. There have been a history of these things among the Seventh-day Adventists, certainly a well-known and well-established history of this among the Mormons. And I suspect within Scientology as well. And the one thing about property, if I could quote Mark Twain, is Twain says, God's not making any more of it. So it brings us to, I mean, it's a commodity like gold, which has a finite, unless one believes in alchemy, it has there's a finite pie of that gold. There's a finite pie of property. One can use it differently. But among the property scandals I'm thinking of is one in particular that really gets the hairs to stand up on the back of some people's neck, which is Ben Lomond. And Ben Lomond versus the Antiochian Archdiocese of the Orthodox Church. But I want to bring up one other sort of question. So the first question is, what does it have to do with if anything, the mortgage crisis and housing bubble? Am I right to perceive that there may be a connection both temporally and in principle? Secondly, What does it have to do with some of these other things that stick up to us but don't occur to us as religious, such as Waco, Ruby Ridge, and some of the history of the Seventh-day Adventist, Mormons, and so on? And the third is, what's it got to do with Vatican II? Because I sense that there were some there were some changes to how the church, the Roman Catholic Church, viewed, handled, and owned and designated property ownership in Vatican II, which also happens right around, and we're talking about time. I don't mean a 3 to 5 year period. I'm talking about a 30 to 50 year period.
Right.
That all seem to be happening at the same time. Am I smoking crack, or am I perceiving some relationship?
No.
And why don't we hear more about this? Is it just that nobody attached the word scandal and the reasons I said, or is it being meticulously downplayed?
I think it's a bit of both. The property scandals in the churches began when there was this movement in the 1960s in the wake of Vatican II for the various churches, particularly in the Protestant world, to kind of keep up with the Joneses. In other words, well, Vatican II's modernizing, we've got to modernize too. And as a result of this, you had a lot of property scandals in just about every church around the country emerge when the hierarchy of a given denomination would throw in with the modernizing tendency and impose that tendency on local parishes. And as a result of that, in some of the hierarchical churches, like the Episcopal Church with the continuing Anglicans, you had the same thing happen in some Lutheran synods. You had it happen to a limited extent within the Methodist Church, which again was a hierarchical church. When parishes did not want to go along with this, they would pull out of their national denomination, and they would attempt to take their property with them. And in most cases, the courts, if it was a hierarchical church, would rule in favor of the church. Not always, but in most cases they did. And what they were doing was they were setting the precedent, in my opinion, that the church hierarchy could do whatever it wanted with its property, in spite of the fact that, in a certain sense, it had broken with its own tradition. And the traditionalists were arguing in court, well, if they break with their tradition, they've essentially broken their contract with us, and therefore we should be able to keep our property. And I suspect that this was literally an attempt in some cases, where many of these churches that were seized by the denomination turned out to be empty. And this was especially the case in the Episcopal Church after the 1976 General Convention, where people, left the Episcopal Church and now they've got the property, but it's empty and not really filling up all that quickly again. What bothers me about this, Daniel, is the recent Pennsylvania pedophile scandal that just broke with all those indictments. When you view that in connection with President Trump's executive order that allows them to seize the assets of any institution or group of people that have been involved in that activity, ostensibly that would mean that he could go in and seize the property of local Roman Catholic dioceses. Now, I'm not saying that I'm approving of the pedophilia that has been going on in the various churches. And I'm not saying I'm approving of their, to me, very lackluster efforts to try and deal with it. And in most cases, that's been swept under the rug. But I do think that there is an effort to tar these groups with a brush of salacious activity precisely in order to seize assets. I do think you're onto something there, because the other flip side of this is you have certain religious institutions in this country, foundations, charities, ministries, and so on, that handle quite a lot of money And if they are implicated in any of these activities, not only could you seize a physical property, you could literally seize liquid assets as well, and literally drain any ecclesiastical body, the local Jewish temple, for that matter, the local Masonic lodge. You could literally drain them of their financial liquidity merely on the allegation that they have been involved in some act of impropriety. And that disturbs me immensely. I do think that there is an effort to transfer property. Now, I do think also that you are correct in the perception that at Vatican II, some effort was made to change the finances of the Roman Catholic Church. As far as I know, prior to that council, church property was totally and exclusively in the hands of the local diocesan bishop. In other words, they were the officer of final recourse financially for the finances of a diocese. The problem there is that within the Roman Catholic Church, you have still the principle of Peter's pence. A certain amount of diocesan income is a tithe to Rome itself. So with that activity, and if you implicate the Roman Church in these activities, you can eventually go on to seize the activities of the central organization itself. I think that if we go back to the pontificate of John Paul I and his attempts, his very apparent attempts to try and begin to clean out the corruption in the Vatican Bank, I think probably what is in his mind is precisely that scenario. That, we've either got a clean house or, we could lose everything here. And I think that was probably a part of his thinking. And I do think that there's a very real danger of this. Now, with things like Waco and Ruby Ridge, I think, again, there's more going on with Waco and Ruby Ridge than meets the eye. Waco, to me, is extremely suspicious for a number of reasons. The videos that we were shown on television of, the BATF under massive fire from Waco, and I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, what fire? There's no bullets zinging off the ground or hitting the cars that they're hiding behind, which if they're under fire, it looks like the fire is all going one direction, and it's not from the Branch Davidians. The thing there that has always puzzled me is that no one is paying very close attention to the list of people that were members of the Branch Davidians, one of whom had the last name with the surname of Noriega. No one is paying attention to the fact that some of the people that went into the computer room in that first assault didn't make it out alive, and we don't know what happened to the computer that they were going after. This has never been explained. The property itself was cordoned off, and I think is cordoned off to this day. And effectively, what you had is a seizure of property. And for what reason, I don't know. But again, the same tactic was in use, as far as I'm concerned, to paint a group of people as being kind of outcasts or cult-like and so on. So, let's paint them in the most unsympathetic light possible. This is a big problem, because if you can seize someone's property for not going along with a severe institutional change, and this is the principle I think that's at stake. If you can seize someone's property for not going along with an institutional change, then what they can do to a church, they can do to any one of us if we should not toe some new doctrinal line, be it Christian or Jewish or atheistic or whatever comes down the pike. That is a problem. And so far, the courts have been willing to go along with that idea, for the most part, not entirely, as I said earlier. But to me, that's a very, very disturbing precedent to set.
Well, related to that, Let's just give an example.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a bishop, Luis Milazzo, who is Bishop Elias, who is a member of a small sort of breakaway synod, Pangratios' synod,
Right. Okay.
who became a bishop in that synod and was running his own Polish Catholic jurisdiction. And he was somehow involved in a transfer of church property to a secular organization. And the Polish church seems to be uncertain as to how they lost control of their property.
Right.
And then he subsequently left that synod and formed some sort of charity or halfway house.
Right.
So this acquisition of religious property seems to be based on a miasma of vulnerability and confusion over ecclesiastical standards versus religion versus normal legal ones. You know, if I came and ran off with your house, you come with a battery of lawyers and solve it really quick. But once there's religious justification, once I say I have the authority to sell this property, I am the pastor, or I control it, I am the bishop, or whatever. Now the courts are stuck disputing, solving a dispute that is religious in nature on the basis of ecclesiastical or canon law, which is not necessarily all that clear, especially when you're not a 2,000-year-old religion. If you're in a Protestant church, it's fairly young, and there are a lot of different versions of that particular denomination, with a lot of different standards, some of which aren't necessarily written so clearly. Right. And so I wanted to use that example to point out that, I'm asking about Vatican II because I'm wondering, not to make Vatican II the scapegoat of everything, but I'm wondering if, to allude to what you said earlier, the changes that occurred in terms of the ecclesiastical meaning or the liturgical meaning or the religious meaning of certain things that ranged from people no longer standing up in Orthodox churches to flipping the altar around in Methodist and Lutheran ones to removing the veil in Roman Catholic ones, to changes of how the communion is distributed, to changes in the prayer books and things themselves. All of these one could argue, there's at least a prima facie case that they are attempts to consolidate not only religious control, but thereby control of assets and property.
Yes.
So therefore, I have to ask you, back to organizations, but this time not secret societies per se, the Consultation on Church Union, the National Council and World Councils of Churches, COCU, and the other things. Is there a chance that those organizations exist primarily to consolidate assets, and that the ecclesiastical language is the changes in liturgical and ecclesiastical meaning, while convenient and expedient, are essentially also a veneer? There is essentially a religious component of changing the ideology and thinking and method of thinking of people and their epistemology, but then there's also a component of control,
property transfer,
and that these two things depend on one another, that you use control for the one and use the religious thing to achieve the control.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct, and I'll tell you why. In Roman Catholic canon law, and for that matter, in Anglican canon law, in Orthodox canon law, there are very, very old canons that very specifically stipulate that a bishop cannot the term is called alienate church property. In other words, he cannot sell a church or any of its appointments for financial gain. Any disposition like that has to be worked out by the church as a whole. And I do think, particularly in some of these large ecumenical merger schemes, that what you have, I remember the case of as I was a boy watching the Methodist Church the Methodist Episcopal Church merge with the Evangelical United Brethren to form now what's called the United Methodist Church. As a component of that merger, of course, they had to come up with how is this property going to be managed. And in effect, what they did was they created a new corporation where the denominations that were merging were effectively surrendering their property to the new corporation. But that new corporation, in turn, then could turn around and order the parishes in those properties to go along with the changes that they were making. So yes, absolutely, this is what's going on. They are driving some of these things for property transfer. And again, this to me sets a very, very bad precedent, because if they can use, let's just call it what it is, if they can use ecclesiastical chicanery to do this, then similar techniques can be applied to any group that does not want to go along with a new or emerging narrative. And that's the problem here. If you look at the Roman Catholic Church, and you look at the Society of St. Pius X, the traditional Latin Rite people, when Archbishop Lefebvre set that up, one of the first things he did was he attempted to go in and reclaim churches that had fallen into disuse and repair them and restore them and so on and so forth, so that he could turn around and claim that he's not alienating any property, he's not taking over any property within the rest of the Roman Catholic Church. And in a few cases, there were parishes that simply stuck with him. And they have been, many of these, in litigation for some time. But again, he was very careful, because he recognized that there was a property issue involved here, and that he had to be very careful in order to ensure that society's survival. So yes, I do think that this is all used. And incidentally, since you talked about secret societies earlier, the same thing, although it doesn't even get, if the church property thing doesn't get any press, the property disputes within secret societies get even less, but they are definitely there when you have lodges splitting off from mother lodges and so on, and what do they do with their property and blah, blah, blah. This is more the case in Europe than it is in this country. But again, the same sorts of things were going on in those cases.
So I want to ask you about another, therefore, decidedly religious question, but it has a tie-in to what we were talking about earlier with Masonry and secret societies, namely the P2 Lodge, Propaganda Due. So there's a little-known fact out there that I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn, which is that a eunuch cannot be a bishop in a traditional Christian confession. And that, in fact, it goes beyond being a eunuch, but that being maimed in and of itself is enough to disqualify one. So maiming somebody invalidates their ability to serve in episcopal office. I am not certain. I don't think it means that if you're maimed while you're in episcopal office, you immediately are deposed. But I don't know.
Well, let me add something right there, because you recall the famous case of Pope Leo III, that fled to Charlemagne. Well, it was blinded, and they attempted to cut his tongue out. Well, the reason that the people were doing this to Leo was precisely that provision. They were trying to create a state where he would no longer be able canonically to function as the Bishop of Rome. And we know the story. Charlemagne, made the deal to come to Rome with some Frankish bishops and hold a trial and uphold Leo's pontificate. But that was precisely the reasoning behind that whole affair. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt your main train of thought, but yes, you're correct.
Well, no problem. So this might seem to be an obscure and irrelevant fact, but there are a number of church fathers. I'm not just thinking of Leo, but there are a number of church fathers that at one time were maimed.
Yes.
And Origen is rumored to have self-castrated
Right.
out of some literal understanding. Origen was the bad boy
correct.
of his era. He really did not follow the apostles' teaching in a number of ways, and so of course he was anathematized as a heretic. But he one of those things was he castrated himself.
Right.
So there's this history of castration being a specific form of maiming in regard to ecclesiastical matters as well. But as you say, blinding, cutting out of tongues. And so what is this? How does this have relevance for you and me, just ordinary Joes out there? Well, I have one is a kind of historical anomaly I want to ask about. And the other two have to do with secret societies and eugenics. Okay. So here are the three questions. Number one, Masonic punishment. You heard that Tony Soprano ritual, may your soul burn in hell as this guy. Well, that's not all they do. So in the P2 Lodge thing, they hung these guys, and I forget what they did to them, whether their hands were cut off and stuffed in their pockets, or they were castrated, or they were blinded, but they kind of mutilated them a bit. And mutilation is sort of built into some of the rites that have been leaked out for betraying your friends in the Masonic order. It's also a norm within the mafia. And I wonder what those things have to do, if any, if that's just coinkydink that those things are not related to the Christian religious significance of maiming or not. So that's question one. Number two is in obviously Jewish tradition, circumcision is certainly a form of maiming, but it obviously it goes way back, right? So 6,000 years, you've got
Egypt did it.
Yeah, and so you've got but you've got the religious significance of circumcision, and yet that's considered proper and not considered mutilation. Although in the early church it was understood, as it still is today in the Orthodox Church, that baptism is the new circumcision. And so what was done with the knife is done with water later, and circumcision becomes a voluntary medical procedure. And I'm not sure about how the early Christians regarded it. I know they regarded it with suspicion if one were trying to do it to simultaneously keep the Mosaic law and the Christian faith, but I don't know whether or not it was forbidden or whether or what. And I still don't know where the church stands on that today. But I'm curious if there is also, is there an occult, Masonic, and mafia connection to this issue of maiming and its relationship to episcopal status in the church? Is there a connection between that and Jewish practice? And lastly, in sort of digging into this, you immediately come, if you Google castration, the first thing you come up with is chemical castration, which has been used as a form of punishment. It's been used as a form of eugenics and race control, etc. And so I'm grasping tenuously at links here that may not be there. But I don't think anybody's been asking these questions, and so this is my opportunity to ask.
Well, I don't know that there's any connection between Masonic ritual references to mutilation and Christianity or Judaism or other religions that practice circumcision. Islam, the ancient Egyptians did it. I don't know that there's any direct connection there. I would aver that the connection is probably, if there is one, much deeper. And that's the whole idea that we find now in the transhumanist movement, to mutilate the human form by way of so-called improvements. Implant computer chips in the brain, and you're going to be new and improved, and so on and so forth, or all of this stuff. And they're arguing, I think, on a kind of a twisted version of prosthetics, that we wouldn't deny an individual who had a limb amputated to give them the best type of prosthetic that they could afford, and therefore that's all we're doing. Well, there's a difference between amputating a limb and providing a prosthetic and making some sort of quote unquote improvement to the human form by computer chips or what have you. I think there has been a wholesale anti-human assault on humanity, and I talk about this in the new book that began to arise, coincidentally enough, or as I tend to think of it, not so coincidentally, in the 18th century, with the rejection of an old cosmology and its replacement by something very, very different. I think that there has been a war on the human form, and in the Masonic rituals case, where you have these quite frankly blood-curdling, kind of chilling oaths that are taken, but in some of these secret societies, again, what you're doing is you're subscribing oaths that the punishment is the mutilation of the human form. And this actually, just to as an aside, during the Masonic scare in this country, during the early 19th century in this country, what caused the scare was precisely that there were a number of murders that were occurring in the country that were so unusual, and the murders were kind of following the pattern of the ritual punishments that were described in some of the Blue Lodge rituals. And that was the reason for that whole Masonic scare, was that they're taking over the country and they're fulfilling ritual obligations here. That was pointed out with the death of Roberto Calvi in London, that he was murdered quite literally in a kind of a parody of a Masonic ritual killing. I do think that what we see and have seen since the 18th century, with the expansion of unbridled humanism, without any sort of moral check, without any sort of bow to anything transcendental, this is when you encounter these types of things beginning to appear in literature. I mentioned Adam Weishaupt earlier. Clearly a guy that has abandoned or jettisoned any sort of idea that morality is of some sort of transcendental order. And, it shows in his writings and what he's willing to countenance, and for that matter, what he's willing to practice. And it's important to note in this respect, since we're talking about ritual mutilation, ritual murder, and so on and so forth, it's very important for people to understand that when Weishaupt founded the order, he very specifically and explicitly claimed for the order a sovereign right. In other words, what he was saying is the order has the same power of life and death over its members as any nation. So he took those oaths very seriously. In other words, he meant and did mean that the order had the right of capital punishment or any other sort of corporeal punishment that it might decide for a wayward member or a traitor or what have you. So that's there. And the problem is, of course, that when you have the Masonic scare in this country, one of the things that people are pointing out, because those documents of the Illuminati had been published by that time, they were pointing to these statements that Weishaupt made, claiming this sovereign right of the order that had a sovereign right as any other nation. In effect, what he was saying is the order is an extraterritorial state. Well, again, we go back to P2G in Italy, and this is very much the way that Licio Gelli ran that order. So I do think that on one level, there's no connection. At another level, at a much deeper cosmological level, I think it's a manifestation of something that begins to happen in the 18th century, and that's this attack on humanity, this nihilism to destroy anything human or humanizing in humanity or its culture. That it begins there, and I talk about that a great deal in the new book.
Well, just to switch gears a little bit away from these ecclesiastical issues and ask you about current affairs and other groups. I saw something interesting across my desk. So, the consensus is that we're in sort of a post-truth environment. Everybody has an opinion, and to quote, not Jesse Helms, but Newt Gingrich. To quote Newt Gingrich, doesn't matter what's true; it matters what people think is true. Yeah.
Right.
So, I want to ask you about deprogramming groups for cults. So I'm going to read you a little excerpt here from an article. Part of an international apparatus of Israeli, American, and British secret intelligence communities, Wetworks capability. Kelly it goes on to talk about this person named Kelly, who is a deprogrammer. Kelly is also the security henchman and a paid operative of CAN. Immediately after the Waco, Texas incident erupted, Kelly and one of his CAN, which is a deprogramming organization, I guess,
Right.
deprogramming sidekicks named Rick Ross, appeared on on national media as experts to explain the events.
Yes.
Explained is in quotes there. And according to various media reports, the central deprogramming advisor for the ATF and FBI of the Branch Davidian sect is in fact the self-same Rick Ross.
Yep.
Along with Kelly, Ross is a leading deprogrammer for CAN. Ross is a convicted jewel thief who was arrested in November, and it goes on to talk about the stuff he's been involved with, pled guilty to commit grand theft, second degree, etc. Ross was under criminal investigation in Washington State for a failed 1991 deprogramming attempt, and Ross was publicly described by the CAN executive director, Cynthia Kisser, unfortunate name, as among the half dozen best deprogrammers in the country. So this is just a little excerpt I cut out of a very, very old article. And what I wanted to ask you about is the relationship between deprogramming groups, intelligence, and sort of a post-truth environment. So, by definition, a deprogramming group is essentially a group of professional kidnappers who take you away and change what you believe or what you think to be true. And so they challenge the assumptions or the epistemology by which you've arrived at those assumptions. They challenge your sense of reality. Right. In that sense, in many ways, they're a version of the men in white coats. So the voices in your head may not be real, but it's still interesting to listen to them now and then, and they don't want you to hear what they're saying, right?
Right.
So I'm interested to know, one, what is the connection between it's more than a connection. Some of these guys are deeply rooted in the intelligence establishment. Yes. What is that connection between deprogramming groups and intelligence networks? Number two, it seems like that deprogramming groups have a hard job to do because it requires you to seize everybody eventually one at a time, or to round them up even in herds, but it seems completely to be an untenable task. Right. And so why would, if deprogramming groups are sort of the green berets of doing that, why focus their attention on low profile targets? And why not utilize a more effective strategy, such as creating a post-truth environment where you can effectively sway what people regard to be as true as easily as showing them a headline? So my question is, the third question is there a relationship between the deprogramming groups of 15 years ago and the intelligence networks that they were embedded in or a part of or networked with, and that arrival of a sense that, well, you can't do this one at a time, and maybe now they're involved in the creation of a post-truth environment around.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, off my head again. Ding, ding, ding. It just so happens that I talk about cults in the new book. The new book is about mind manipulation. And let's go back to Jim Jones and the Guyana tragedy. When Congressman Leo Ryan began getting complaints from people in his district and began to investigate the People's Temple, he very quickly came to the conclusion that many of these cults were actually CIA fronts, and that had been deliberately created as, and I think it's crystal clear in the case of Jim Jones, that they had been created as kind of, if I can put it this way, adjuncts to the MK Ultra mind manipulation program. And I also view, as I point out in the book, I also view the CIA's efforts to control and manipulate the media, Operation Mockingbird, as a part of that effort. And I also view its post-World War II efforts to manipulate the arts and to drive modernism in the so-called high arts into the popular culture, and then also its efforts to infiltrate and manipulate the popular arts, and in particular the popular music of that era, as being one thing. It's all kind of under this umbrella of mind manipulation, or I think, as you're accurately putting it, citing Gingrich, this post-truth culture that we're in has, I think, been created to a large extent covertly by these efforts, and in a certain sense, we're watching a bit of the blowback now. When we say that, I'm trying to get my cigarette making equipment out here. When we say that, if we are willing to grant the premise that some of these cults are the products of some sort of covert program, if we're willing to grant that premise, which I think is fairly well substantiated, at least in that one notorious case, and I have my suspicions about the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and the Moonies and so on and so forth, that these two are creations of a mind manipulation program. One of the more classic ones, in my opinion, being the Jehovah's Witnesses. You look at Charles Taze Russell and his connections to secret societies, the connections that are most likely there between that and Skull and Bones and so on and so forth. It stands to reason that you are also going to want to make sure that you have some understanding, if not ability, to manipulate, quote unquote, the deprogramming process. Now, in the case of Can and Rick Ross that you mentioned, if you dig a little further, you'll find out that Ross and Can, in turn, had definite connections to B'nai B'rith. So you've got that percolating in the background as well. And, the connections between B'nai B'rith and the Israeli Mossad have been a matter of some popular conjecture for some time, even to the point that B'nai B'rith has been accused in some places of actual espionage activity on various American citizens. So I have no difficulty envisioning that some deprogramming activity, particularly if it's associated with people like that, may itself be yet another manifestation of these mind manipulation programs. And the reason I say that, Daniel, is if you go back to some of the original MK Ultra documents, the ones that survived Richard Helms' purge of those files prior to him appearing in front of Senator Frank Church, the old senator from Idaho who led the Church Committee hearings investigating the MK Ultra activity. Senator Church, if you recall, was just absolutely appalled at what the committee had found and discovered, and he went on the old television program Face the Nation, and he was very blunt about what he was finding and what the committee had found, and he viewed it as, and I think quite correctly, he viewed it as a direct assault on the very nature of the American Republic and our civil liberties. He found documents which have since been published in a variety of venues that set up the MK Ultra program. And in those documents, Daniel, you can read very specifically that the CIA wanted to find out what it would take to literally program an individual, and then what it would take to deprogram them. So in other words, right there in those original documents setting up that whole program, you had the nucleus for exactly what you're suggesting, that they wanted to investigate all aspects of it, including not just the programming, but the deprogramming. And let's go further. If you recall, I don't know if you've read the Hess book or the new book, but if you recall, Rudolf Hess made tremendously sweeping allegations at Nuremberg. And of course, he was laughed at the time. And basically, he was alleging that there was a massive mind manipulation effort that had occurred in Nazi Germany, and that the leaders themselves had succumbed to it. And of course, he was laughed out of the picture. But what most people don't know, and the readers of those books and most of the members here, I'm sure, have read those. What most people don't know is that Alan Dulles suspected that the Hess he was dealing with in Nuremberg wasn't the genuine article, and he brought an American physician in to examine the individual at Nuremberg, and guess who it was? Well, it was Dr. Ewan Cameron. And if you look at Dr. Ewan Cameron, he subsequently goes to work for the CIA when Alan Dulles is the director in the MK Ultra program at McGill University in Canada, where he is literally trying to create a program, what he calls psychic driving, literally to reprogram the personalities of individuals that supposedly come to his, and I'm using this term very loosely, his hospital. And he subjects them to all sorts of what I can only qualify, Daniel, as medical torture. There's no other word for it other than that, in an effort to reprogram people's personalities. So as far as I'm concerned, Daniel, your hypothesis here is absolutely spot on, that deprogramming itself is as much a form that could be influenced by these intelligence agencies as the programming itself. Absolutely, I think that.
Well, we've reached close to the end of the show, and now I want to play a game called Pick Your Poison, which is I'll hold out some virtual cards. You'll be able to see the label on the card, and you can tell me which ones you want to address.
Which ones I want to drink in the Kool-Aid?
Yes. So here are your choices.
Oh, jeez.
Posse Comitatus Act.
Uh-huh.
Diary of Colonel House and the Lusitania.
Oh, jeez.
The Avignon Papacy.
Oh, God.
Splitting of the Oak.
Uh-huh.
And the American-Serbian War.
Oh, my. And I have to pick one of these?
No, you can answer as many as you like, but
I don't know what the question. I don't know what the questions are.
I know. I don't know what the questions are in a couple of cases. I'm leaning toward, the Colonel House one. I'm hoping you pick that as one of yours, but we'll see what.
Well, yeah, I want to hear about that because I don't know anything about it.
Well, I don't know about that. So, all right. So here's what I want to ask you. So in the Diary of Colonel House, there is the following excerpt. I am given to understand, or this is what do you call it? Not a summarization, not a précis, but a paraphrase of the excerpt. Okay. So on the morning of May 7th, House and Gray drove out to, and I can't read the word there, KUW period. We spoke, quote, we spoke of the probability of an ocean liner being sunk, and I told him if this were done, a flame of indignation would sweep across America, which in itself probably carry us into the war. 1 hour later, House was with King George in Buckingham Palace. We fell to talking. Strangely enough, the colonel wrote that night of the probability of Germany sinking a transatlantic liner. He said, I suppose they should sink the Lusitania with American passengers on board, ? Unquote. That evening, House dined in the American embassy. A dispatch came in stating that at 2 p.m, a German submarine had torpedoed and sunk the Lusitania, and many lives have been lost. So my question to you is, was this a coinky-dink? Is this an act of prescience, temporal distortion, or did somebody know that the Lusitania was getting sank? And what did Colonel House have to do with it, if anything?
Well, there's always been suspicion that
and this should be the standard question, Dr. Farrell. What does Colonel House have to do with anything? Anytime you ask that question, the answer should be something.
Something, yes.
If he was alive, he has something to do with
it. That's right. Oh, that pretty much sizes the man up. No, there's always been speculations that the Lusitania was a deliberately staged or concocted event to rank up the war hysteria in this country, to go, to enter World War I on the side of the Entente, and which of course eventually under Wilson, aka Colonel House, it eventually did. And the thing that I've always found very suspicious about the whole thing is that the route of the Lusitania, the ocean liners at that time period were well known to the Germans, and the schedule, of those transatlantic ocean liners was published in the New York papers at the time for all to see. So it's a fairly easy matter for a German spy to learn when certain liners are going to sail, and communicate that to the embassy, and then the embassy communicates it to Berlin. So that's easy. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science to figure this out. But what the interesting thing is that in recent research, Daniel, it has been discovered that the Lusitania probably was carrying arms from the United States to Great Britain, just as the Germans claimed at the time that they sank the ship, because the ship went down rather quickly, and some of the witnesses that survived the sinking do report that they heard more than just the explosions of the torpedo hitting the hull, that there were internal explosions. And this to me has kind of ramped things up for Colonel House. Let's just put it this way: for Colonel House to be sipping tea with the King of England, I think George V at the time, for him to be sipping tea with the King of England, talking about the Lusitania within minutes of confirmation of the disaster, to me is just kind of a confirmation that, yeah, he was probably involved in some form or fashion. I have no doubt about it. Now, the interesting thing is that in spite of the Lusitania, as you know, that was 1915. The United States does not enter World War II until the declaration of war in, I think it was April 1st, April Fool's Day in 1917, when Wilson asked Congress for the declaration of war. So it took 2 years. And really the thing that did it was when the Germans declared unrestricted submarine warfare around England. And that was kind of the last straw. So the Lusitania kind of led up to it, but it didn't succeed in terms of getting us into the war. It just kind of ratcheted up the anger and hysteria. But yeah, I mean, Colonel House is kind of the I don't know what you'd call him. He's kind of the George Soros. He's kind of the Vardis of the Wilson administration. There's really nothing he doesn't.
He's the Oprah of the airwaves of this.
Yeah, he's the Oprah. He's involved in just about everything, and it's interesting if you look at the man, and then the people that accompany Wilson to Versailles. You have Colonel House, of course, But who else do you have in tow? Well, you've got Allen Dulles, John Foster Dulles, McCloy. So you've got literally a whole generation of movers and shakers that, in my opinion, kind of looked at him as their mentor and example of how to run the deep state. House wrote the textbook.
So out of the remaining, if you had to pick one, and it was the Posse Comitatus Act, splitting of the Oak, Avignon Papacy, or the Serbian War, what's your pleasure?
Oh my word. I would have to say it's a toss-up between the Serbian War or the Avignon Papacy.
Great. Then I'm going to ask you the Avignon Papacy question, because I don't even know what the splitting of the Oak is, and that's what I was going to ask. What the heck is that thing? I found it in a timeline that somebody may have left on his dining room table 20 years ago, but
The splitting of the Oak was the ceremony that supposedly separated the Priory of Zion from the Templars.
Oh, okay, that makes sense then. And that was in 1350.
All right.
Okay, so the Avignon Papacy, great. That saves time for the last question, which I will ask. So what I struggle with is the relevance of the Avignon Papacy to us today. It is still widely studied. There's still books about it, although they tend to hit the bargain shelf at Barnes and Noble. You still make quite a lot of it, and it's certainly a fascinating point in history. But short of the response that that's an ecclesiastical matter, I'm not Christian, I don't care about that, it doesn't affect me. What is the answer to that question, aside from the issue of episcopal succession and
little problems like that,
and maybe Caesaropapism and stuff like that?
Teensy weensy tiny little problems like
just
that.
Imagine that I traipsed into your medieval history class at the University Center at Tulsa, and I plopped down my brand new textbook and I threw my hair back, and I popped open a juice box and asked you this question.
What is the relevance is very simple, because it was an Avignon Pope, Clement V, that was the Pope at the time that King Philippe le Bel, he was supposedly King Philippe le Bel's man in the papacy. He was the Pope. The papacy was at Avignon when Philip le Bel moved to shut down the Templars. And again, if the Templars seem like an obscure, unconnected thing to modern times, I point out what I said in Rotten to the Common Core, and that is, if you want a model for the modern foundation, like the Carnegie Foundation or the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation or what have you, all of these foundations that are supposedly nonprofit, that allow their heads to retain control of their wealth and move them into tax-free shelters, it's the Templars that are the model.
Dr. Farrell, do you have a crying infant on your knee? What is?
No, I have no, that's Shiloh. She woke up from her nap and she's now coming over here telling me that she has to go. You have to go outside, don't you?
That's adorable.
She says,
another side to Dr. Farrell emerges.
Yeah, Shiloh says that she has to go outside, don't you? Yeah.
Well, we're at the end of this show anyway. It was a random question about the Avignon Papacy, so
there you are. That's the relevance. It's a strike against a foundation.
It's a foundational issue.
It's a foundational issue.
All right. We won't go into, had there been time, I was going to go into the fundamental questions that define medieval history and philosophy, being religious, and how those are very often a cover for other issues, or a shorthand or code for other issues. But we've used up our time, so it's time to move on. And your dog's got to go.
And the dog has to go.
And I don't want to be here for the kissy stuff that happens. I can't look at that, whatever that is. The licking, face licking, and all that.
Oh, she's a sweetie. She's a sweetie.
Oh man. All right. Okay. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you.